Good evening, and thank you for coming to tonight's program featuring Peter Beinart and David Myers. I'm Andrea Grossman, the founder of Writer's Block, now in our 29th season. Before I get to Peter and David and Peter's haunting book, Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza, I need to talk to you about security and safety for all of us tonight. Peter doesn't fill his material with a lot of nuance these days, so as a result, he's attracted some attention from people who might want to disrupt tonight's discussion. We have security here, and we have notified the Beverly Hills Police Department that Peter and David are here. Beverly Hills Police have created a special watch for tonight, and all relevant personnel have been made aware of this very hot ticket at the music hall. If there's any sign of a disruption, we will not hesitate to call our friends at the BHPD and have any disruptors removed and charged at the very least with disturbing the peace. So thanks. Now that I've read you the literal riot act, we can move on. The cataclysmic Hamas attack on October 7th, 2023 created a firestorm, not only in the Middle East, but also in world Jewry. That Israel would respond with massive force was no surprise to anyone. But even long before October 7th, Peter Beinart was an outspoken critic of Israel's treatment of Palestinians who live within Israel's borders and occupied territories. In his new book, Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza, Beinart challenges Israel's war on Gaza, its methodology, and its policies in the West Bank. Every Palestinian humiliation, injury, or death creates a spiral of hatred and violence. He argues that creating Palestinian equality as opposed to its destruction is the only sensible way to ensure security and safety for Israelis. This book is pretty deceptive in its force. Peter lulls you along with compelling stories that often sound like rabbinic tales. And then the shoe drops as he slams you with shuddering truth. So when I thought about hosting an event with Peter, I knew that there could only be one moderator, David Myers. His list of accolades is ridiculously superb. He holds a distinguished chair in history at UCLA. He's the director of the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. And here's my favorite part. His book, American Shtetl, written with his wife, Nomi Stolzenberg, right here, was named one of the best books of 2022 by The New Yorker, and it won the National Jewish Book Award in American Jewish Studies. Okay, so here's what's going to happen tonight. We've asked for you to submit questions via email due to the challenge of passing a mic around in this space, and I didn't want to have you have any potential disruptors get the mic. So we're also passing around note cards, and Cousin Terry will be walking around collecting the note cards. They'll get to as many as possible. Book Soup is here with copies of Peter's book. You need to read it if you've looked at the news in the last 30 years. Thank you. Peter Beinart and David Myers.
Great to be here with you in Beverly Hills. I want to begin with just two notes of appreciation. The first is to Andrea for sustaining this remarkable project that is Writer's Block for 29 years. It's an incredible achievement. I know the infrastructure of the organization is robust and staffed by many, which is to say you, but it's really, really extraordinary. I also want to do something that's going to embarrass the person I'm going to mention now, but I'm just so proud. My brilliant undergraduate student, Celie Fisher, was admitted to 3 graduate programs today in Jewish studies. So I can assure you the future is bright for our field. And with that, hi, Peter.
Hi.
Very good to be this close to you. Or maybe we should move a little further apart. The first question. The book is entitled Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza. And so I want to ask you, what does it mean for you as a Jew to be Jewish after the destruction of Gaza?
Thanks. Well, first, I just want to say how grateful I also am to Andrea, who I know had to work incredibly hard to put this on, and I'm really, really grateful for that. And also how honored I am to be here with David, who's someone who I've learned so much from over the years has really influenced my thought very, very deeply, and is also just a tremendous mensch in the way he deals with people, which is a kind of a model for how I try to handle my interpersonal relations as well, including with those who I disagree with. And in that regard, I wanted to just, before I answer the question, I also just wanted to say that I always hope when I look out at a crowd like this that some of the people I'm looking at disagree with me. I think one of my fears in writing this book and in general is that I'm always just talking to people who are already inclined to think in the same way that I am. And this book was written for those people, but it was really written more for the people in my own life who I care about very deeply, who very, very strongly disagree with me, to try to express things in book form that I just felt over and over again I could not adequately get across in our conversations. And so if you are one of those people who's done this kind of unusual thing of going to listen to someone you disagree with, which is so rare in our community and in our country, I'm really grateful to you for doing that. It says in Pirkei Avot, who is wise, the one who learns from all people. So I feel like if you've traveled the furthest ideological distance to listen to me, then you're actually showing the greatest degree of wisdom, and I'm really grateful for that. I think for me, part of what being Jewish after the destruction of Gaza has meant in some ways is realizing that I need to root myself more deeply in Jewish things that are not connected to Israel and Zionism, not because I don't feel a very, very deep attachment to the people, to Jews in Israel and to the land, but this sense that I always fear that Judaism in the American public discussion and around the world was kind of being swallowed and overtaken by this ethno-nationalist project. Someone told me recently that at a prominent synagogue, whose name I won't mention, after October 7th, a few weeks after October, the rabbi turned to the congregants on a Friday night and said these astonishing words: turn on your phones. This was on Shabbat. Turn on your phones so you can donate money to the Federation because of what's happening in Israel. And it seems to me like that is a kind of like manifestation, right, of a kind of swallowing of Judaism by this particular ethno-national political project. So part of me, I think, has felt that I need to redouble and deepen my investment in aspects of Jewish study and life that remind me that Judaism is much, much bigger than this and much, much older than this particular political project. And I think the other thing is that being Jewish after the destruction of Gaza has meant trying to figure out how it is that our organized community managed to be supportive of something which I think if it were happening in any other place in the world, being done by any other state, we would simply see its horror and its immorality as self-evident. It wouldn't really be much of a debate, right? And so it's been trying to figure out how it is that so many people who in so many parts of their lives are thoughtful and good and decent can watch what I've been watching every single day now for 15 months, and I fear will restart again any day or week now, the destruction of an entire society, and say it's okay. You know, it seems to me that's an example of something having gone really, really profoundly wrong. And my book is an attempt to try to understand why this thing went wrong and how we might think differently so it doesn't happen again.
Well, I want to talk a lot more about the intended audience of the book, but I want to add just one more piece to what I think being Jewish after the destruction of Gaza means, and sort of name it even more explicitly, which is what comes through, certainly between the lines, and you'll speak to it more fully now, is the sense of obligation as a Jew to attend to the suffering of Gazans, and for that matter, to support the cause of Palestinian liberation. That, it seems to me, is sort of what lies between the lines of, alongside your desire to decouple your sense of Jewishness from Zionism and sort of upend this system by which Jews are turning on their phones on Shabbat in order to donate to the cause of the Israeli military campaign.
Right.
But let's name, what really
Yeah.
is at the end of that road, which is the Palestinian cause.
Yes, right. I mean, I guess to me, one of the things that I've always found really fascinating about Judaism, and I think makes it perhaps somewhat different than Christianity and Islam, is the particular tension that exists between, on the one hand, a religion with a universal message, and on the other hand, a religion that kind of has this metaphor of family at the root of it, family which becomes a kind of a people. And then, so on the one hand, there is this notion that we have special obligations to one another, and I'm okay with that. I'm comfortable with that. I feel those obligations very strongly in my own life. But what I feel like has been so lost in mainstream Jewish public discourse, especially since October 7th, but even before that, is any sense that there needs to be a kind of a balance between the notion of solidarity with other Jews and the notion that we have moral obligations to all people, that Torah doesn't begin with Jews. The first people in Torah are not Jews. Adam, Eve, Noah, these are not Jews. These are universal human beings, right? And it seems to me, and I kept going to events after October 7th again and again and again. And the events were very powerful and very poignant and very moving, and they focused on the enormous and terrible suffering and horror that happened on October 7th, and the ongoing horror of the hostages and even of Israeli soldiers who was killed. And I kept feeling, yes, I believe all those things. I feel all those things. And yet the fact that Palestinians were never mentioned in most of the events that I went to, and certainly never mentioned by name, no effort to humanize Palestinians at all, I began to feel like this is not Judaism to me. This is completely lost in a really terrible way, the sense of trying to hold the balance between ourselves as a family, but ourselves as a family with obligations to all human beings, right? And that, I think, is part of what I feel like is at stake for us in our support and complicity for this utter catastrophe, this thing which I think increasingly is being understood by scholars as a genocide that our leadership has been complicit in.
So how is it going in terms of holding together that balance that you described? And I mean, we see every week now the release of hostages, and it's an enormously emotional event for Jews the world over. And we just heard the news that maybe the Vivas family will not make it out alive, which is so deeply heart-wrenching, which can overwhelm one within that Jewish cocoon in which we both dwell. And then one remembers the scale of destruction, which is almost beyond comprehension in Gaza. How, I mean, this struggle is our struggle. It's my struggle.
Yes.
Many people struggle here.
Yeah.
It's a struggle that began on October 7th. It's a struggle that was exacerbated by October 20th. And we've lived it ever since. Where is it for you? Where is that balance for you today?
I mean, I think it's like a horror movie that's just getting worse and worse. I mean, I have always had this fear in the back of my mind before October 7th that the way the organized American Jewish community functioned vis-a-vis Israel was there was no independent moral standard that would ever allow people to say this and no further. This is too much. Essentially, what happens is Israel acts, and then the organized American Jewish community comes up with a kind of post hoc justification for whatever Israel does. So I remember when I was always constantly being told that Israel's political leaders really, really wanted to create a Palestinian state, but the Palestinians just wouldn't accept one, right? And then when Israel started electing people who emphatically screamed their opposition to a Palestinian state, the line became, well, of course they oppose a Palestinian state. It's far too dangerous to support a Palestinian state, right? It's like, and so I sometimes am listening now in the last couple of weeks since Trump's statement of a call for mass ethnic cleansing, I sometimes think, wait a second, if a month ago I had said that the mainstream political leadership in Israel, not just the right, not just Benjamin Netanyahu, but Yair Lapid and Benny Gantz, would be enthusiastic about an act of mass expulsion, of mass ethnic cleansing, people would have called me an anti-Semite. They would have said, how could you slander Israel like this, right? And now it happens, and I hear people say things like, well, we need some out of the box thinking. It's creative. Nothing else has worked. We need a new paradigm. Maybe we don't all know how all the details will work out. And I'm thinking, what is this? This is monstrous, right? And this is why at the end of the book, I was writing about the idea of Israel as an idol, Israel treated as a god, as something to worship. Because even if you say you support something, you have some independent standard against which it can be judged, international law, or just the lives of the people in this state, right? Who should be the final arbiter of the legitimacy of the state. But that's not the relationship with Israel. That Israel's value is unconditional. It's no matter what it does, that becomes justification in and of itself. And that, I think, is it is that impunity that America has given Israel, in part because of the work of the organized American Jewish community, that has now led us to this precipice where, from what I read in Israel, I don't know how you read this, David, what I hear in the Israeli commentary now is that if this ceasefire agreement does not go forward, and they don't go to a second phase, which seems quite likely, that Israel is making plans for a more ferocious war in Gaza, for a war in Gaza that will be worse than what we have seen now, a war in which Israel will explicitly say that when it goes into areas, it bars all humanitarian aid from coming in which Israel will have much more firepower because it doesn't have those troops in the north anymore, so it's going to deploy them all into the south, in which basically the war will be a response to Donald Trump, which says, you gave us an invitation to mass expulsion. Here, we are going to do it. We're going to move all of the Palestinians into one small area of Gaza for you, and then you can figure out how to get them to Somaliland. And this, to me, is where we have ended up because of a kind of an idolatrous relationship to the state.
I want to talk about the idolatry of the state, but I want to go back to a kind of persistent question of mine, which is why you were so persistent in trying to persuade fellow Jews. The audience of this book, as you state very clearly, is the Jew with whom you disagree. And you begin the book by talking about various pairs of Jews who found themselves in a relationship of constant dialogue and disagreement. Elisha ben Abuya and Rabbi Meir and the two protagonists from Chaim Potak's The Chosen. If you ask, at what point will people sort of tip to understand the depth of destruction? At what point will the blindness collapse?
Yeah.
I guess I'd ask you, at what point do you simply surrender your attempt at persuasion? I mean, I say that as someone who's engaged in precisely the same perspective.
Right. I mean, I think you understand the answer to that question, David, because it's not an intellectual answer. It's an emotional answer. I don't know. I
just have to say, before you begin, that actually in the midst of the Second Intifada, a group of us gathered under the inspiration of the great Rabbi Leonard Bierman, whose widow is here with us today, the great Dr. Joe Bierman, under the heading One Community, Many Voices. Because we felt then that the mainstream communal position was so far from ours that we had to articulate a different voice.
Right.
And yet, we wanted to make very clear, nobody is going to push us beyond the bounds of that community and the communal institutions and the sense of belonging that are also important.
Look, it's partly because I just see. I think when my mother came to the United States, she had this tremendous fear of that America would be a place in which you would be left without a sense of community and a sense of and I think because in South Africa it was not a question. The Jews were basically in a little shtetl under apartheid, and it was something that you had whether you wanted or not. And she saw that America was a place of kind of radical choice in which you could be kind of almost anything or nothing. And I think somehow that was her deepest fear for us, is that we would be kind of lost to the Jewish community, that we wouldn't have the sense of kind of communal bonds that was so important to her and so important to my grandmother. And I think that, so it's for me, it's like not, it's something I can't think about it's not really imaginable to me how I could live a rich life alienated from Jewish communities, and especially more religiously observant Jewish communities, because I have such a profound admiration for the depth of commitment and knowledge and kind of daily practice that I feel like is so deeply nourishing and sustaining in my own life. And so it's this kind of constant like love-hate relationship, I guess,
Well,
you know, and this desire I see so much astonishing beauty and thoughtfulness and seriousness and commitment. I just want that to also reflect itself in the way we deal with this great moral crisis.
I guess the most succinct summary of that sensibility which you've described is the line attributed to various thinkers over the course of the 20th century, most recently David Moissaint. The tragedy of my life is that the people I daven with I can't talk to, and the people I talk to I can't daven with. The people I pray with I can't talk to, the people I talk to I can't pray with.
Right.
And that is, in some sense, our predicament.
Right, and it's so depressing to me to see people who, when they talk about so many other things, Jewish texts, have such sophistication and such intellectual curiosity and such tolerance for fierce and open debate. And then it comes to this issue, and then they're just like repeating these dead talking points. And I feel like saying, have you questioned any of this? Have you really studied? You know, they say, well, Hamas is just using the human shields. That's why most of the hospitals are destroyed. And I feel like, have you read any like of the human rights organization's reports on this? Have you actually looked into what international law says about human shields? Why are you just recycling these things that you heard without any questioning or scrutiny? Because it seems so not befitting of the person that I know who doesn't live and act that way in other aspects of their life.
So I want to mention, kind of in this vein, something that a good friend of mine, the really quite remarkable Israeli historian Adam Raz, just wrote or is about to publish in Haaretz. It's actually a critique of one of the people from whom we draw great inspiration, Yeshayahu Leibovich, the great Israeli biochemist, philosopher, and critic of the Jewish, of Zionism and the state of Israel. And what he calls attention to is a slogan that was associated with Leibovich, Hakibush Mashchit, the occupation corrupts us. And Raz says this was an obsession of many Israeli leftists who were followers of Leibovich. But the point that was missed is this isn't about our shame or our guilt. This is about the people who are suffering.
Right.
So, you know, the beauty of your status in life is you're regarded as a traitor from one side and a kind of weak-kneed liberal Zionist collaborator from the other. And some have said, like, who cares what a bunch of Jews are crying about?
Right.
Like, people are dying on the ground.
Right. I think it's a very legit. I totally an understandable response, especially because the American media and certainly American politicians are so much more concerned about Jews than they are about Palestinians, right? So then in the midst of an environment in which Palestinians still lack permission to narrate, in which Jewish lives are so much more elevated over Palestinian lives, and then you write a book about being Jewish, right, in the midst of this genocide. I think my response to that, and I thought a lot about it as I was writing in conversations with Palestinian friends, a number of whom read the book, is to say, if this movement for Palestinian liberation is to succeed, and if it's to change American policy, so America is no longer complicit in this destruction of an entire society and this oppression of a people, then part of that struggle has to be a struggle to change the American Jewish community, because because the American Jewish community is such a organized American Jewish community, not the only force. Obviously, they're Christian Zionists, but such a formidable force that can block and intimidate and harass so many people who could be part of this movement, scares many of them from being part of this movement, right? How many Democrats in Congress, right, if they weren't worried about AIPAC and all the AIPAC adjacent groups, would just be able to wake up in the morning, look at what was happening in Gaza and say, no, what the fuck? Why are we doing this? Right? And have that basic human response, right? But they can't, because they've spent their entire political careers in a defensive crouch, not wanting to be Jamal Bowman or Cori Bush, right? And this happens in the media, and it happens at universities, right? And it really fills me with shame to see the way that our community wields the moral authority that we have, because people don't want to be called anti-Semites for good reason, right? Because of the horrors that were committed in the name of anti-Semitism, and then uses that in the most promiscuous and sometimes kind of vicious ways to basically try to intimidate people who just are responding morally in the same way that people responded during Vietnam, in the same way people responded during apartheid South Africa, and the same way people responded going back to slavery. These are the Americans who have always led these great movements. And if the American Jewish community can't be moved, I fear that this movement can't become what it needs to become.
I think that's a really important instinct that we should hold on to. That without that change, and one of the ways, so this book is both a cri de coeur, it's a cry from the heart, a cry of your enormous pain and anguish and sense of shame and guilt. It's also a book that engages in a project of reclamation. And you mentioned at the beginning, you are sort of a student of an alternative tradition to that which is undergirding the project of militarism that has proven to be so destructive. So can you tell us about that reclamation? What does that tradition look like? And in the book, you talk about, for example, the holiday of Purim, which is the next Jewish holiday coming up.
Right.
And we could talk a lot about Purim. You describe it not at all inaccurately as a tale of vengeance, and as enormously significant in the recent history of the state of Israel.
Right.
So tell us about that project of reclamation.
Well, I think that the argument about Purim is that in American public Jewish discourse, we have turned many of our holidays into this kind of, put it into this template of, they tried to kill us, we survived, let's eat, right? And that's kind of the way we tend to narrate our sacred texts and our own history as well, in which Jews are in the role of kind of permanent virtuous victims. And the point I was trying to make with Purim is that our texts actually tell a much more complicated story about Jews. It's not always that our texts are morally condemning Jews when Jews, maybe it's anachronistic to always use the word Jews, Israelites, whatever, at various points Jews. It's not always that our texts are condemning, right? But the texts are showing Jews in a full range of different roles, right? Whereas I feel like in the way that we tend to talk about Jews today, we fix ourselves in one particular role, and it's this endless cycle of reenactment of that role of the virtuous victim, right? So after October 7th, what happens immediately? This is the biggest number of Jews killed since the Holocaust, and it's a pogrom, right? And the Palestinians are Amalek, right? So as if it's not like the Palestinians are having some particular experience here that we might need to understand on its own terms, but they're just the reincarnation of those that in every generation come to kill us, right? And so all we need to know about them is that they're Jew haters who have a pathological desire to kill Jews, right? And so then you don't really have to pay really almost any attention to what was happening in Gaza on October 6th, right? Which is, of course, I shouldn't even have to say this, but of course not to justify, right, the massacre and slaughter of civilian abduction of civilians. It's simply to say that if you want to prevent October 7th from happening again, and then you have to understand the context in which this is happening, right? Which is not the same context as the Russian Empire in the early 20th century when you have pogrom, or Nazi Germany, right? It's in very different context, because the context in which Jews enjoy legal supremacy, and Hamas is responding to that oppression in an immoral and I think illegal way vis-a-vis international law. So that's, to me, the problem with the Purim stories. The Purim ends is not just a story of Jewish victimhood and survival. It's a story in which, in chapter 9 of the book of Esther, after the king has turned his signet ring and Mordecai is given permission, that that Mordechai and the Jews massacre 75,000 people. Right now, there are people who come up with defenses for this, who will say there was no other way, this was self-defense. But even that is at least a reckoning with this story, right? As opposed to an erasing of the story, which is, I think, what tends to happen.
Or a simple indifference to the story. One continues the frivolity as if
Yes.
nothing's happened.
Exactly.
I mean, my own practice is to now avoid a synagogue on Purim, to read in the company of a small group of people the Book of Esther,
Yeah.
and to prostrate oneself when we come to
Right.
the ninth chapter,
Right.
and have a very profound argument, a discussion about what it means to engage in acts of vengeance,
Yeah.
which almost of necessity perpetuate a cycle of violence, as we have seen. So
Right.
continuously.
And I think if
So what
my
do you do
guess
with
would
the ninth
be,
chapter?
I mean, to me, I think this should be my practice too. Generally, my practice is to look around at what's going on and feel extremely uncomfortable, right? And feel like something is really wrong, and thinking, why aren't we now reading in the trope of Eicha, right? In the trope of Lamentations, in a mournful trope, rather than this kind of happy sing-song trope. But I think that it seems to me there's a connection between the way you're responding to Purim and the way you are responding to the destruction of Gaza, right? And there's a clear line between the fact that in most Jewish spaces, people are not encouraged to do that, and that in those same spaces, they're not encouraged to actually grapple with what Israel is doing in our name.
Okay, I want to talk about another text that is part of your project of reclamation. Actually, a figure in the Book of Numbers, Korach, who rises up in
Right.
rebellion against Moses, and makes the point that Kol Hayadak Doshim, the entire community is holy, not just you on high.
Right.
So I've always sort of appreciated him for his
Right.
kind of proletarian,
Right, kind of
a revolutionary,
a populist.
Yeah,
Right.
Well,
Right. Okay. Right.
a liberal
Right.
left,
Yes.
maybe radical left,
Yes.
proletarian populist.
Yes.
But you make a different point
Yeah.
in line with Leibniz. So could you
Right.
explain why you're
Right.
unnerved by Korach?
Right. So the question is that for many commentators is what was so bad about what Korach was saying, right? And Moshe himself said another place says if only all the people were prophets, right? So what's wrong with saying that all the people are holy? And Leibniz's point is the problem is to say that the people are inherently holy, right? That not that they aspire to holiness because they try to keep the law, but because there is something inherent in them that is holy. And to me, the reason I think that critique is valuable is that I think it gets at something about the way that we tend to talk about Jews today. As if people wouldn't use the language of holiness, but essentially as if there is something inherent in us, right? Maybe because we are in this permanent victim role, that means that we can't do these terrible things. It's funny because people are so resistant and have this extreme response to the use of the word genocide, right? But in the organized and people will say, how can you, the genocide is the Holocaust. But in fact, when it comes to Darfur, right, or when it comes to the former Yugoslavia, or when it comes to China's treatment of Xinjiang, Jewish groups are not so upset by the use of the term genocide. The State Department just before Biden left, they called what Sudan was doing a genocide, right? So the problem is that they're horrified by the prospect that it could be done by Jews, because the idea is there's something about us that means that we could not be doing this.
Right.
And I think that's the danger.
It's a combination of perpetual victimhood and the description of holiness, the self-description of holiness that somehow combined.
Yes, it's not that we are different because we are commanded we are commanded by a certain set of commandments that are different than what other people are obligated to, but that there is something physiologically different in us somehow that means that we are inherently different no matter whether we abide by law or not.
Yeah, I want to come back to your project of reclamation, but you've mentioned the G word on several occasions, so I think we can't avoid it.
Yeah.
At what point do you think Israel's military campaign in Gaza became a genocide?
I mean,
if it is your belief that it is.
Look, I'm not a scholar of genocide. So a lot of ways what I do in these things is I simply try to follow people who I think who are, and see what people who have spent their lives studying genocide are saying, right? And I think in particular, I was influenced by Omar Bartov, who initially was actually reluctant. He did not immediately go out. There were genocide scholars who immediately did go out and say, we think this is genocide. Omar Bartov was very, very cautious, right? But eventually, I think that, again, once you destroy all the fundamentals of life, right? You've destroyed most of the hospitals and most of the schools and most of the universities and most of the agriculture, right? That yes, not everybody is dead, right? Not everybody is going to be dead tomorrow, but you have made you have taken an entire group of people and you have made the place in which they live completely unlivable, catastrophically unlivable, right? And so I don't think that one has to reserve. We don't reserve the term genocide for situations in which everyone is killed, or even there's an effort even to try to kill everybody. I mean, the United States, it was never said that in Xinjiang the Chinese government was trying to kill all the Uyghurs, right? We said they were trying to destroy them as a people by putting them in these concentration camps, refusing them to allow them to pass on their culture, torturing them, preventing them from practicing Islam, separating them from their children, right? And so this is, it seems to me, a project of a destruction of a people. If you take a territory of 2 million people and you destroy all the foundations of life.
And if so, what do you think justice looks like on the other end?
I mean, we're so far away from that, as you know. But I think in my ideal world, you would have a state in this territory in which everyone was equal under the law, and in which there was a process of truth telling and justice seeking, as in South Africa and in other parts of the world, in which people would have to account in some way for what they did. And it wouldn't only be Israel. I mean, in the truth and reconciliation process in South Africa, the ANC, actually, the African National Congress had to account for the fact that they were doing things like practicing torture in their camps in Lusaka, Zambia, and other places. So I think it would be Hamas that would also have to go through that process. But for me, justice would be, it's just amazing to me to hear all these people saying that, that the Palestinians in Gaza need to find a place to go other than Gaza, as if the Palestinians in Gaza haven't been trying to go to a place other than Gaza since 1948, right? A place that many of them can see from their own homes, right? The place from which their families were expelled. So justice to me would be, again, maybe it sounds utopian, right? Justice to me would be that the people in places like Nir Oz and Be'eri, who were killed and destroyed on October 7th, will be able to live there safely in a place that they love and are deeply attached to. And the Palestinians who are from those very same areas can also go and live in those places that they love freely and equally alongside you.
There are so many directions in which one could go, but as an interim step, can or should justice be found in The Hague? Meaning,
I hope so.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things I find so frustrating about the conversation about Palestinian violence and Palestinian armed resistance is it seems to me so hollow to condemn Palestinian violence, particularly Palestinian violence against civilians, at the same time that you do your best to shut down any nonviolent Palestinian efforts at resistance and achieving justice, right? It just seems to me, it's not that people aren't sincere when they condemn those things. It just seems to me it's self-defeating on its own terms. People are being brutally oppressed. They're going to resist. The question you should be asking yourself is, what kind of resistance do we think is ethical? And how can we support that ethical resistance, right, in order so that people are less likely to resist on the way that October 7th happened? And my friend Mohammed Shahada, who I talked to a lot for this book and just in general, who I've learned a lot from Gaza, has told me about conversations he's had throughout his entire adult life with members of Hamas with whom he grew up. Mohammed is opposed to violence against civilians. And he's told me about conversations in which members of Hamas have said to him, Mohammed, how well have your efforts worked, right? Have you achieved anything for us, right? I mean, for goodness sake.
An example, we should just remind, an example of a nonviolent form of resistance.
Is going to the International Criminal Court, going to the International Court of Justice, boycott, divestment, sanction, the Great March of Return, right, which Israel responded to with the enthusiastic support of the United States government, the Israeli and the American Jewish community by basically putting snipers, right, on the border between Gaza and Israel and systematically shooting people in the kneecaps or below. And then Gaza had to create a Gaza amputee soccer team, right, in a place where they're sure as hell not going to be able to get the medical treatment you need to be able to deal with being an amputee, right? That's the way we respond. Even when the Palestinians developed a strategy of appeasement and collaboration, right? When Mahmoud Abbas and Salam Fayyad said, here's our strategy. We will stop armed resistance against you. We will work hand in glove with our occupiers and our oppressors to reassure you that we can be trusted with a state, which is something that the Nelson Mandela or Jerry Adams would never have done in a million years. Even that, they got nothing for that, right? When Salam Fayyad left Palestinian politics in 2013, he said, I couldn't stop settlement growth for one day, even though I did everything that Israel wanted me to do, right? So these are creating the conditions in which we make this horrors like October 7th more likely.
So where does that lead you in political and I suppose moral terms in thinking about armed resistance, which is a recognized category
right.
in international legal instruments?
To me, the key distinction is armed resistance against a military and armed resistance against civilians, right? If soldiers are coming to attack you, you have the right to defend yourself, right? I mean, no one is questioning that Ukrainians have that right when they're, I mean, maybe Donald Trump is now, but I think most people would recognize that we're not asking the Ukrainians to respond in purely nonviolent ways to their invasion and occupation by the Russians. But I do think the moral character of a liberation movement is defined in part by its effort to maintain the distinction about the rules of war and international law and violence against a military force and violence against civilians. And tragically, and I think horrifically, Hamas has violated that principle again and again. It did on October 7th, but it did in the 1990s with suicide bombings, and it did in the Second Intifada with suicide bombings. And I think that's really tragic. And I'm not sympathetic to people who say, because you've been brutally oppressed, that any means are therefore acceptable. I think that even under conditions of tremendous oppression, you still have moral choices. And those moral choices are really important because Israeli Jewish life is precious, right? Human life doesn't stop being precious just because you're on stolen land. We're all on stolen land, right? And yet our lives are still precious. And I also think that the character of a liberation movement is defined by its moral practices, even when it doesn't have state power.
Okay, I want to talk about morality and sort of it connected to our discussion about holiness. We began by talking about Korach. You follow in Leibovich's path and your understanding of Korach, and Leibovich very famously excoriated the tendency of Israelis to cloak the state of Israel in the veil of holiness.
Right.
This is a holy project.
Yes.
Sort of confusing the political from the sacred.
Yes.
The mundane from the celestial.
Yes.
That's a path in which you follow.
Yes.
Talk about what that conflation has done in terms of actual political and military action.
I mean, I think what it's done is that it has created this discourse in which the non-negotiable fundamental question that is asked is, does Israel have a right to exist as a Jewish state? And, Leibovich was a two-stater. He did believe in the idea of a Jewish state. And yet, I mean, we don't know where he would be now, but that's what the position he had before he died. But on the question of whether Israel has a right to exist, his answer was no. No state has a right to exist. That states are just instruments, and that what is non-negotiable are the rights and dignity of human beings. And I quote Heschel in the book, who said that the only thing that's created in the image of God is the human being, every human being, right? And so it seems to me the right way to what Leibovich was saying about states is that you start with the human being, and then you ask the question: the state is an instrument, a tool. How good is it? How good a job is it doing of protecting the right to exist of the people who live within it, right? And so what angers me and frustrates me about this question, does Israel have a right to exist as a Jewish state, is that implicit in that, right, is that the people of Gaza have no similar right to exist, right? Whereas if you started in the reverse way and you said the right of people in Gaza to exist is what's sacred, because in Jewish tradition we believe that human beings are of infinite value, then you work backwards and say, could the state be doing a better job of protecting the right to exist of these people? And if it's doing a really, really terrible job, in fact, it's killing them in very large numbers, then you reimagine the nature of a state, right? And yet that's what is considered an illegitimate thing to do in American Jewish discourse.
Right. I mean, which is to say, we confuse means and ends. Right. A state is a means to assure certain desired ends, whereas Leibovich's critique, which you follow the path of, is the state has become not just an end, but a source of holiness, which in his and your view is what's known as idolatry. This is idolatrous.
Yes. I mean, you and I both know from our own personal experience that in many, many Jewish spaces in America, and not just in America, around the world, it is considered a greater offense, right, to question the legitimacy of the state of Israel than to question the authority of the Torah, right, the existence of God, or almost anything in Judaism. I quote in my book the statement that's on Hillel's website, Hillel, which deals with Jewish college students. They say, essentially, I'm paraphrasing, we don't care if you keep kosher, we don't care if you keep Shabbat, we are radically pluralist on everything, right, on small things that are not important to Judaism, like Shabbat and kashrut, right? But on the question of Israel, right, there, in fact, we have a very, very clear line that you're either in or out.
You quote Leibovich in saying, the legitimacy of the Jewish state is conditional on how it behaves. It is subject to law, not a law in and of itself, right? And so you countenance much criticism on this conditionality of the Jewish state. I mean, that is, according to the logic of the holiness of the state, sacrilege. Right? That's a sacrilegious proposition to condition the existence of the state. You then go on to say, it's really the political form of a state that we should understand to be malleable and changeable.
Right, and we do in many other contexts. Right, there are many states around the world that American politicians talk all the time about how those states could be more just and treat their people better. Right, and I think they're right about that. Right, but with Israel, that conversation stops.
Leibovich famously wrote in his essay from just over 70 years ago after Kippur, that morality does not know of an adjectival qualifier. There's no such thing as Jewish morality. Right? Sometimes I hear you, and for that matter, myself, as a Jewish moral exceptionalist, right? You sort of have this project of reclamation of a virtuous Jewish tradition. Help me understand myself by really unpacking that idea.
I mean, look, I think you're getting at something important, which is always a danger, right, for us to want to read into Jewish texts and Jewish tradition our own particular morality, which is created in a very particular moment in time, right? And I think that's in some ways, I think that really misunderstands the nature of a relationship one should have with an ancient and extremely diverse tradition, which is part of what's powerful about the tradition, I think, is that on the one hand, you feel like it's yours, you feel very deeply connected to it. On the other hand, it's radically unfamiliar, right? Its terms of debate are so different, right? I mean, I was just been studying tractates Sanhedrin in the
Bust out. You're doing Daf Yomi.
Yes, I'm doing Daf Yomi. Right. I'm terrible. By the way, I'm terrible. Daf Yomi is a practice that means a page a day. You study a page of Talmud a day. I'm actually really terrible at Talmud. There are people in this room who are actually very good at Talmud, but I try in my largely incompetent way. And so Sanhedrin is about the court system and rules and laws. And so a few days ago, it says that the judges of the Sanhedrin should know all of the languages of the world and be able to practice sorcery. So I'm thinking, I really don't know what the heck to make of this, right? It's very, very hard to understand. And I think that's in some ways what's great about being part of an ancient religious tradition is it takes you outside of your norm. It's right. It's not like you turn the page and it's another statement that could have been made by Bernie Sanders, right? That's not the point, right?
A great telminess in his own right.
Right. But I think it also means that because it's so vast and ancient and it has so many multiple voices, that whether people admit it or not, they have to actually make choices about what they elevate in their own mind. And so there's nothing wrong with saying that for people like you and me, right? It's those voices in our tradition that speak about human dignity that speak to us most powerfully, just like voices of Jewish supremacy speak most powerfully to Itamar Ben-Gvir, and we're going to fight him, but we're going to fight him from the position of saying we are speaking from within our tradition too, not as the only voices in our tradition, but these are the voices that we want to elevate.
Just a program note to the audience. I have many, many more questions to ask Peter, but we are going to break for your questions in a little under 10 minutes. So please sit and wait patiently for that moment. I guess it's a kind of twofold question. Help us understand your path from 2010 when you wrote that essay on the failure of the American Jewish establishment in the New York Review books, which then became the foundation for your book, The Crisis of Zionism, 2012, to being Jewish after the destruction of Gaza. How do you chart your own journey from that point of realization in 2010, which was so, in some sense, bracing and shattering for people, and presumably for yourself as a former kind of center liberal-y kind of guy who edited the New Republic? What's that journey been like over the last 15 years? And ultimately, I want to get you to answer the question, does that leave you in the same place that you were a couple of years ago as a self-described cultural scientist?
Yeah. I mean, I guess it's been a process of learning, learning, intellectually, but also maybe trying to become just emotionally more comfortable or psychologically more comfortable with truths that I found very, very difficult, trying them on, seeing if I can wear them and still feel like, and becoming more accustomed, I guess, to things that at earlier times maybe seemed too foreign or threatening to me. I think a lot of, I was a supporter of the two-state solution, and I felt that in some ways, as every year passed, and the prospect of a sovereign, contiguous Palestinian state became less and less likely, that I began to feel like my own statements were starting to ring a little bit false in my ears. And I remember one Palestinian friend in particular said to me something like, Peter, the two-state solution can't be perpetually dying. At some point, it's dead, And I realized that in some ways, the reason that I always was saying, it's 5 minutes to midnight. 5 minutes to midnight is actually the title of a column written by Anthony Lewis about the impending death of the two-state solution in the New York Times in 1982. So people have been doing this for a really, really long time. And I kind of realized that I think the reason that I couldn't imagine that this was no longer a viable paradigm was that I was too afraid to think outside of that paradigm. And it was really reading Palestinian writers in particular who were thinking outside of that paradigm that I think began to open my mind to the possibility of legal equality, and to the prospect that in fact this could be a situation in which Jewish life in Israel was actually safer than under conditions of legal supremacy. And I think it was partly
equality for all between the river.
Yes, equality for everyone between the river and the sea. And I think, I also, one of the issues that I think I had always probably skirted around a little bit and not really wanted to really face head on was the question of Palestinian refugees, right? Which is a question that is very, very difficult to deal with within the paradigm of partition, right? Because the whole point of partition, at least from the Israeli Jewish perspective, is to maintain the Jewish state, the large Jewish majority, which is undermined if you let Palestinians return to their homes. And I remember that particularly around a few years ago, around Tisha B'Av, when Jews remember the destruction of the temples and kind of talk in the first person about this happening and kind of and talk about the desire to return, I just began to be seized with the kind of absurdity of the idea that we are this people who kind of never lost our connection to this land, and yet we're expecting Palestinians to lose the connection to the places they're from after 75 years. And the more that I allowed myself to read and engage and talk to Palestinians who were the children of this refugee experience, the more I just began to feel like I had no remotely plausible ethical argument for why Palestinians shouldn't have the right to go back to the places they're from. And that the assumption that just suffuses Jewish discourse, that if they were to return, it would mean Jewish death, or at least Jewish expulsion, began to more and more seem to me to be a product of a kind of racist and dehumanizing way of talking about Palestinians, right? As if that's what they would do because those are just their hobbies, you know? As opposed to being able to imagine that even though things are difficult and challenging and complicated, the right that people can live together side by side under conditions of equality if their rights are respected.
Yeah. What about your self-definition?
I mean,
Zionist.
To
And
me,
maybe you could
yeah,
excavate a little
Yeah.
what that means for you. It means something very specific.
right. I mean, cultural Zionism was a set of ideas that originally, connected to the writer who wrote under the name of Chatham, and then picked up in the 30s and 40s by people like Martin Buber and Judah Magnus, who believed in a Jewish cultural revival in Palestine, land of Israel, whatever you want to call it, but didn't support a Jewish state. And the reason that Buber actually explicitly opposes the creation of a Jewish state. He testifies against partition. The reason I think that tradition is valuable, I understand that the term Zionist is very, very freighted, both for people who love it and for people who hate it, right? And that generally I find that even if I tell people that I consider myself a cultural Zionist, many Jews will say, in fact, that's not true. You're an anti-Zionist, and people tend to not believe me, right? But to me, the value of the cultural Zionist tradition is that in our discourse today, it's so often simply assumed that if there's not a state that gives Jews legal supremacy, that you can't have flourishing Jewish communities in this land. And I think it's valuable to remind people that there were some pretty heavyweight figures in Jewish history who saw these things as separate, who cared a great deal about the revival of Hebrew as a living language, about Hebrew-speaking communities in this land, but didn't believe those things required a state that privileged Jews over Palestinians, and in fact, maybe even saw a Jewish state as antithetical to that project.
Right, and that particular vision of a single state is a binationalist vision of a single state, as opposed to the vision of a single state as a state of all citizens who are equal. It sort of adds to that latter vision the idea of discrete cultural nations having the right to regulate their cultural affairs and be supported by the state in doing so, but without necessarily demanding sovereignty as a condition of their existence.
Yes, so legal equality as individuals, right? But a recognition that the state has two peoples that both have a very strong kind of national identity, right? Which should allow them to, educate their children in the language that they want, to have a public culture, a public calendar that recognizes, the Jewish public calendar and the Muslim and Christian public calendar, the kind of thing that you can see in Belgium or in Quebec or another place.
Right. So for decades, I've been saying to anyone who would listen, love it or hate it, the two-state solution is an impossibility. The settlers have decided the day. It's simply an impossibility. After 10/7, I thought to myself, but the idea of Jews and Palestinians at any point in the near future dwelling harmoniously in a single state is also an impossibility.
Right.
And that sort of reveals to us the kind of tortured and trapped logic of 2 versus 1. So necessarily, I and many others began to look for alternatives. And one of them is the idea of a confederation, which is a highly imperfect mediating path between the two, but nonetheless offers up new opportunities. I mean, to get to any of these solutions requires a bridge, whose first important station is the reconstruction of Gaza and the sort of elevation of the economic status of Palestinians and the creation of some measure of political horizon. The pendulum of history must move in that direction first. It requires, however, a bridge before we get there. So how do you kind of see that? We can talk about
Right.
what I
Right.
think both of us believe,
Right.
whether it be in two or one,
Right.
the ideal model, a binationalist vision.
Right.
But getting there is really the crux of the matter.
Yes, and I think a crucial, a really absolutely crucial step in that, right, is that Palestinians have to be able to choose their leaders in a legitimate way. So Palestinians can say, this is our vision. This is the way in which we want to vindicate our rights, right? So the the PLO made this historic decision in 1988 to embrace the idea of partition after, being against it for many decades, supporting what was sometimes called the secular democratic Palestine. But Israel and the United States in various ways have not allowed Palestinians to have a process in which they choose their leaders. And it seems to me if Palestinians don't have the ability to choose their leaders in some kind of legitimate process, right, then it's really hard for these conversations to go anywhere, right? Because we need to have some understanding of what the Palestinian national movement wants, or at least the range of different ideas that Palestinians are putting forward. But that can't happen basically if you are not willing to allow Palestinians to go through that process of political self-expression.
Okay, I'm going to ask a final question, then we'll turn to the questions of the audience that I've collected. Your book is one of several. There's kind of a spate of books that have attended to the use and abuse of Jewish-Israeli power. And I'm thinking here of the book of our friend Michael Mencken, End of Days. I'm thinking of Ta-Nehisi Coates, The Message. I'm thinking of the new book. I'm not sure if you had a chance to read it, by Pankjav Mishra.
I haven't read it yet.
The World After Gaza, which begins and carries throughout the idea that you talked about, the perpetual victim. In his case, it's a borrowing of the German philosopher Karl Jasper's idea of the metaphysical victim that is perpetuated over generations. And I'm curious how you position yourself within that spate of works. And sort of the final point I want to leave our conversation on, what's noticeable amongst that group of writers is none of them is Palestinian. And you have really insisted in your frequent public appearances and declarations that we need to raise up Palestinian voices in understanding the Palestinian condition. So where are you located? What do you think that moment is about?
Yeah.
And can you share with us some of the Palestinian voices you think are most important for us to know?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very tricky thing about, I think, the role that someone like me occupies, because I have this, what I would say is kind of unearned, undeserved privilege, right, in the conversation, because it's easier it's easier for many institutions to have a Jewish critic of Israel like me make these criticisms than to have a Palestinian make these criticisms, right? Because it's a little harder to call me anti-Semitic. It's not impossible, but it's a little bit harder. And so one of the things that I always worry about is that basically, like, I end up actually occupying space, right, that otherwise could be occupied by Palestinians in this public conversation. And especially since October 7th, there's so little space for Palestinians in this conversation. So what I try to do, I'm not sure if it's adequate or not, but what I try to do privately in my interactions with media, institutions, and others is try to always suggest Palestinians that they should be platforming. And then also in, the newsletter that I put out to every week, be suggesting Palestinian books that people might want to read, in addition or even instead of my own. I just noticed that Roger Shahada has a new book, for instance, called
that seems to happen every year or so.
Yes, and Roger Shahada is right. I know, it really, and I think it is very much addressed to this moment, right? I think it's called what does Israel have to fear from Palestine? But I often suggest people, read Edward Said's classic book, The Question of Palestine, partly because I think it's such a powerful way of helping people who have only grown up thinking about what Zionism means to Jews to help understand what Zionism means from the standpoint of its victims, as he talks about. There's actually a tremendous wealth of different writing if one just kind of starts to open oneself to it. I was really taken by Fida Jewry's memoir of her really unusual family story called Stranger in My Own Land that came out last year. And I think that my hope is that the conversation evolves to a degree in a way in which Palestinian voices are much more common and more normalized, and partly because I think that the way that Palestinian absence deforms the conversation is partly that it ends up that people like me, who are Jewish critics, get put in the position of being asked to speak for Palestinians, which is an absurd position to be in, right? Palestinians should speak for themselves, and we should have so many Palestinians in the conversation that we can see that there are different Palestinian perspectives, right? It should be normal on American television to have more than one Palestinian panelist offering different perspectives that both come from the Palestinian experience, right? Or multiple Palestinian columnists in a particular publication, right, who express different points of view. We take that for granted with Jews, right? You've got Bret Stephens, and you've got Thomas Friedman, and you've got Michelle Goldberg, all at the New York Times, and different versions, right? Like, it's almost inconceivable that we could have that with Palestinians, and I think that's where I hope we'll get to one day.
I just want to add one other note to that, which is, it seems to me that the single most important revision that could be made to the Jewish educational curriculum, especially for young people, is the incorporation of Palestinian literature. It is essential to just overcoming that almost sort of essentialized, fixed position of blindness. And here I'm thinking of a generation actually before the current generation, thinking of the incredible novels of the great Lebanese author Elias Khoury, the great novelist of the Nakba, whose sensitivity and awareness of the trauma of the Holocaust are really unparalleled. Or the brilliant short story by the Palestinian intellectual Ghassan Kanafani, Returning to Haifa, Said Darwish. If Jewish education incorporated those texts into the curriculum, there could be some of the change that you and I are so desperately seeking.
Right, and also if Jewish education incorporated those things when people were in high school or in junior high school, we would not see things playing themselves out at universities in the same way, right? Because
I never heard the word occupation until I got to college.
Yeah, because it's really a betrayal of these kids, right? To not give them any decent education about this subject. The decent education has to be allowing you to see things from different perspectives, right? And so then you go to campus and it's Israel Apartheid Week, right? And your response is, oh my goodness, if I walk past it, it's going to be a threat to me, right? And so you're conditioned almost to feel threatened by ideas, right? As opposed to being exposed to ideas and wrestling with them before, and maybe in a more nurturing environment before you get to a university. And so then you don't end up in the situation where you don't teach these things to Jewish kids in the Jewish institutions. And then when they get expressed at universities, you basically try to suppress that speech at university.
Right. Okay. We're going to feel free to applaud if you would like. Let's turn to your questions. Oh, well, he does some money. How about me? Okay.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
No, I'm good. Thanks. I'm fine. Okay, so here's just a kind of very topical, but not fully on topic question, but one for which you're equipped to address. In December 2024, some Jewish Democrats in Atlanta wrote to Republican Governor Kemp and asked him to run against Democratic Senator John Ossoff. How could any Jewish people push for a Republican senator, given the context of the current administration pushing Germany to embrace Nazi politicians?
Right. I mean, this is the other part of the disaster that we haven't talked about, which is that I don't think I need to tell people in this room that American liberal democracy is in a moment of peril that I think I never perhaps thought I would see in my lifetime. And American Jews are an unusually politically articulate and influential group of people, right? And yet the most powerful institutions that we have created, right, can't actually be part of the struggle to protect American liberal democracy in this moment of peril, right? Because their primary agenda is protecting unconditional support for the state of Israel, right? So the fundamental way that they evaluate politicians, or not just politicians, they evaluate anything in the public realm, is not, is this person someone who believes in the principle of the rule of law, right? The question they ask is this person a reliable defender of unconditional support for Israel? And lo and behold, it turns out that the people who are most reliable defenders of ethno-nationalism in Israel, because they believe, they like the idea, and who are willing to support Jewish supremacy unconditionally, are also people who believe in ethno-nationalism in the United States and have a vision of a kind of white Christian supremacist or white Judeo-Christian supremacist country, right? They actually want America to be much more like Israel. And so you end up in league with the Brian Kemps of the world, right? And you end up being complicit in this global ethno-nationalist project that menaces liberal democracy all over the world.
Okay. Next question. What does it mean when an American Jew says, Israel is my homeland?
Well, I mean, I think part of the challenge here also is the term Israel means both the state and the land, right? And it also means the Jewish people. So the slipperiness of that is partly because of the differences of, I think that, this I think is an idea that it, comes out of Jewish religious tradition, right? Which sees a return to this land as something that our sacred texts are constantly talking about, as a kind of an imagined future that Jews look forward to. And then this idea of homeland, I think, becomes a kind of nationalist kind of expression of that tradition, that religious longing, right? I don't know exactly what people necessarily mean by that. Maybe one of the things they mean is that they were raised, again, in Jewish traditions, which always looked forward to the idea of a Jewish messianic return. Maybe what they mean is that there's something about being in a Jewish kind of civilization or society, which is very powerful when you are a small minority group. I think all of those, there's nothing wrong with any of that, right? I think as long as it doesn't become a justification for the principle of Jewish supremacy. I don't think there's anything wrong with seeing Israel as a Jewish homeland, right? As long as one recognizes that doesn't give Jews any more rights in that land than anybody else.
So this relates to another question, which actually makes reference to a conference that I participated in several weeks ago at Brown University, entitled Non-Zionist Jewish Traditions. And the questioner notes that Professor Adi Ophir, one of the organizers, pointed out that one must be anti-Zionist before one can be non-Zionist. And that resonated with the questioner and many other young anti-Zionist Jews who have participated in the student movement. And so the question is actually for both of us, do either of these terms resonate with you? Neither of them, both of them. So maybe you go first and I'll go next.
I guess I feel like sometimes the debate about the term Zionism is not the most constructive way to have these conversations. I think partly because the term is both, in Jewish discourse, it's a very intimate, very emotionally loaded term, but often also a very ill-defined term. And so I think, I've mentioned this before, but the Canadian political scientist Mira Sukharov really exposed this when she did something that the American Jewish organizations never do, which is she went beyond.
She's in LA.
I heard Mira.
She could be in the room.
I don't think Mira is here. Actually, I texted her to ask her because I actually couldn't believe that she willingly decided to go from Canada to the United States in this moment. But anyway, she generally the Jewish organizations ask American Jews, do you consider yourself a Zionist? And they say, aha, a majority consider themselves Zionists. But she said, she gave different definitions of Zionism. And when she asked American Jews, do you consider yourself a Zionist if Zionism means that Jews have superior legal rights to Palestinians, most American Jews said no. But when she said, do you consider yourself a Zionist if it means you have a strong connection to Israel, they said yes. Right. So I think in some ways, to me, part of what is more valuable is talking about the set of principles that I believe in that should govern in this territory, right? The principle of equality under the law. And if you think that equality under the law is compatible with Zionism, to me, I would argue that it's not compatible with the Zionism that existed since 1948. But in some ways, to me, it's less significant to me that whether you think it's compatible with Zionism or not, than that you embrace and believe in the principle of equality under the law. Because if you believe in the principle of equality under the law, then I think we can say that it's immoral to hold Palestinians under military law in the West Bank. And indeed, it's even immoral with inside Israel proper to have something like the Israel Land Authority, where most of the land in Israel is under the jurisdiction of an entity that gives almost 10 of its seats to the Jewish National Fund, which manages and distributes land only for the use of Jews. I think it actually becomes a really pretty radical proposition to say you support equality under the law.
Right. So I'll take a crack at that. I have a different answer that is not in alignment with my friend Adil Fir's call, nor that of another friend who spoke incredibly powerfully at that Brown conference, Professor Bashar Dumani. My sense of things is that although Zionism was born in multiplicity, it never was in its first formative phase a single thing. There was political Zionism and cultural Zionism, socialist Zionism, and religious Zionism, and then revisionist Zionism. So there was a multiplicity of ideological perspectives that over time developed into or was conquered by a single dominant one, the statist version, which from the 1930s really crowded out all the others, became the guiding ideology of the state of Israel. And I think over recent decades, it's really crystallized into a doctrine of Jewish supremacy. And for that reason, I no longer can call myself a Zionist. I can't call myself an anti-Zionist either, because I think all too often that ignores what I think is the undeniable link, historical and cultural, of Jews to that place, to the land. So I'm pretty comfortably situated in the middle, in the category of the non-Zionist, which once upon a time was actually a rather venerable designation. Indeed, this is how, for example, one of the most renowned legacy Jewish organizations, the American Jewish Committee, defined itself up to the late 1950s. It defined itself as non-Zionist, which is to say it understood that there was a reason for the state of Israel to take rise, especially in the wake of the Holocaust, but it did not support the movement of Jews the world over to that place. So I kind of operate in that legacy for different reasons, but that's where I find myself today. You want to weigh in on anything about that?
No, go ahead.
Okay. All right. We shall continue. This is one of my favorite questions. Is your book available on audio?
Yes.
Do you want to elaborate on that?
No, you can read it on audio.
All right. As a Jew and as a progressive in LA, I've had a very hard time talking to some of my friends for the past 2 years. Has anyone had that experience? I want to use the current moment. How do I do that best? Surely you've had people who, you talk about very dear friends in the book.
Yeah.
Who stopped speaking to you.
Yeah. And
October 8th or something like that.
Right. And I know you've had your own version of that. It's difficult. I think that I try, first of all, to avoid any political conversations on this subject with people I care about, where there are going to be disagreements that are electronic. I basically when people send me texts, if they're not people who are important to me, I just will say, I think we disagree, but I appreciate you writing or something like that. If they are people who disagree, who are important to me, then I feel like my response is we should talk about this in person, because I feel like the conversation is always a disaster. And so I used to even have almost kind of would like, my go-to was to suggest like a walk on Shabbat afternoon, where I felt like we could spend time together and talk.
Alicia.
Yeah, exactly. And
parallel.
just, because I think a lot of communication is nonverbal. And so there are ways in which you can express disagreement that are different when you're with someone and you can see them. And it's important to show that some person that you're listening, which is hard to do also electronically. So I think that's one thing. I think that it's oftentimes with some people, there's just an understanding that we just don't talk about this subject. I have a very dear friend who has told me for many years that he never reads anything I write. And I think that's valuable for our relationship. And we have a really important relationship. It's based on other things. And I think that's okay. I have lots and lots of people that I can have these conversations with about the subject, and it doesn't need to be with that particular person. But even those practices of mine have sometimes felt really inadequate, and they've been really hard, because I just felt like I have radically failed a lot of the times in trying to express what to me is, I would have hoped would be more self-evident, which is that my opposition to the war, my opposition to Jewish supremacy, are rooted in my love and care and solidarity for my people. In addition to my deep, deep concern and belief in justice for the Palestinian people. To me, they're not an expression of lack of concern. They're my best effort at expressing concern, right? And I always would kind of hope that people would accept that as an idea and say, we think that you are expressing this concern in a radically incorrect way, right? Rather than questioning the motive, right? But I so frequently find that I fail in that effort, and that people's assumption is that this is coming from a place of indifference or even malice, right? And I sometimes